So good morning everybody, very nice to be here, and I'd like to thank the Society for inviting me. It's brilliant to meet so many people that normally only meet as part of a test tube or on the phone. So, I'm at St Thomas's. I set up the Nutra Status unit several years ago now with a focus on the development and application of novel markers of vitamin status. And our strategy is a simple one. So we don't just focus on measuring the vitamin itself, because actually that's telling you how much of it is there, not necessarily how much of it's being used. So it's not telling you much about the utilisation. So we try and combine a static test, for example, like Serum B12, with a functional marker, something that's telling you about how much of that vitamin is being used by a particular enzyme. So there are at least 4 markers that we can use in the laboratory to assess vitamin B12 status, but most laboratories only use 1. Okay? Now, of course, if you're only using a single marker, it's quite simple. But here, there are different tests that could be in your laboratory toolkit. So one of them, of course, is a pathological marker, and it's not very sensitive. It's not very specific, as all of you know. So that would be hematological dysfunction. And we know, as we heard earlier... Sure. Sorry, thank you for telling me. Okay. So I like to walk around. That's all right. So you can have mean cell volume, but that's not specific. It's not sensitive. And as I'll show you later on, of course, that's an end stage, really, of the diagnostic process. So we have 2 static markers available, the Serum B12, and I'll also show you later that it has a relatively high rate of false negative results. We have the Active B12, which has been known about for a long time, but it's only in recent years that the assays have been automated and made simpler enough for most laboratories to use. And then we have 2 functional markers. One is a homocysteine, and that indicates methionine synthase function. And we have methylmalonic acid, and that indicates the methyl coenzyme A mutase function. Okay, so that's 2 different functional markers. Now, if you're only using 1 marker, it's simple because you know the answer, don't you? But of course you don't, because if you, like a man with only 1 watch, if you have more than one, if you've got 1 watch, you have nothing to compare it with. Yeah, so you can't really be sure, can you, that you know the result. But if you have 2, that brings complexity, and if you have 4 markers, well, that can make it really difficult indeed. But each marker is telling us something slightly different. So apparently conflicting results in reality may be logical and just representative of where you are in your stage. So let's look at this staircase to deficiency. Now, normally when I'm teaching this to students, I say to the room, most of you will be at this stage, you'll all be replete. That's probably not the case in this room, and there's a journey towards deficiency that you may take. So in the unlikely event that you are replete, the first, as you move to early serum depletion, the first laboratory marker that will show that something's up is the Active B12 will start to go down. Okay, so that's telling you there's a negative balance. That's telling you that you are probably using more B12 than the fresh B12 that's coming in. So that's an early indication. As the negative balance continues, in addition to the decrease in the Active B12, you may start to see an increase in the other markers that I mentioned to you just now, the methylmalonic acid and the total homocysteine. If allowed to progress further, we may start to see evidence of damaged metabolism, and at this point you would certainly start to see an increase in the methylmalonic acid and the total homocysteine. And it may not be until this stage that the serum B12 starts to go down. So you can see it's quite a late marker. And by the time you see a hematological dysfunction or a neurological presentation of the B12 deficiency, then actually it doesn't matter probably which marker you use, they'll probably all tell you that you're deficient. Now, I'm making a lot of assumptions with this model, but it's the simplest one that we have. And those assumptions here are the cutoff values for the different tests, because there is not very much consensus about the appropriate cutoffs. Okay, so I'm trying to present to you in simplistic ways the way that I can understand it, okay? But this is certainly a work in progress. So to help you understand the difference between some of the tests, I just want to tell you a little bit about what happens to your B12 once you absorb it. So as soon as the B12 is absorbed, it meets one of two potential carrier proteins. One is called transcobalamin, and the second one is called haptocorin. Now, if we look at this graphically, you will see here, so the TC is the transcobalamin in this case. You'll see the transcobalamin, that's one of the two proteins, is the most abundant one. You will also notice from the diagram that the majority of the transcobalamin is unsaturated. Okay. Now it's called unsaturated because in that form you've only got the protein, you haven't got any B12. All right? So it circulates around until it meets some B12, and because there's such a lot of unsaturated protein there, it grabs the B12. So then we refer to that protein and B12 combination as hollow transcobalamin. And the companies that market the tests also call that Active B12. So that's what the Active B12 is. It's B12 that's bound to transcobalamin. You'll see there's a second protein. That's the haptocorin one there. Now that floats mainly in a saturated form, which means most of that protein has already found a B12 molecule to bind to, but it doesn't just bind B12, it binds things that are similar to it, so analogues. Okay, so we've just had a little overview there, the two different proteins that your freshly absorbed B12 will meet, and the key difference here is there's a lot of transcobalamin is unsaturated, and that's ready to take the recently absorbed B12. Now it's the transcobalamin, the hollow transcobalamin, that is what your cells need. The B12 needs to be delivered in that form to be of use, okay, because they have receptors for it. So your cells have receptors for the hollow transcobalamin, also known as Active B12. So it's the same thing. When I say Active B12, when I say hollow transcobalamin, that's the same thing. Okay. Now what you will see is that transcobalamin is very good at delivering B12 to your cells. So estimates are about 4 nanomoles of B12 into your body a day. Now the haptocorin delivers far less, about 0.1 nanomoles per day. So, in the laboratory, the vast majority of laboratories are using the Serum B12 test, and that's actually giving you a total. So that's measuring B12 that is bound to the transcobalamin and B12 that is bound to the haptocorin. So you're getting a total. Now we know, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, that there are interferences with this test on all of the widely available analyses. So you have antibodies that interfere with the test. And we know from experts that patients with pernicious anemia, definite pernicious anemia, diagnosed pernicious anemia, that are then sent to the CM B12 test, about 22 to 35% of these are missed by using the CM B12 test, just because of interferences. Okay, so it's nothing about the utility of the CM B12 test itself, it's about interferences with the assay. So let's look at the Active B12 test. So this only measures the cobalamin that's attached to the transcobalamin. So it's hollow transcobalamin. And it uses very similar technology to the Serum B12 assays that your laboratories will use. But it doesn't, at the moment, seem to be interfered by the antibodies that people with pernicious anemia will have. So we go back to this chart that you're familiar with now, just to highlight the difference. So if your GP or your local lab offers this test for you, the Serum B12 is actually reporting a total result. Whereas the Active B12 test is only measuring that portion. So it's ignoring the portion that your body doesn't use or doesn't appear to use, or we haven't understood the utility of it yet. Okay, so that's the key difference. Now, how do we compare this? So we're going to look at it in several different ways, because that's the first question we always get. Well, how do we compare the CM B12 with the Active B12? And actually this particular graph isn't a very good example, because what you're making here on the x-axis, which is the one that goes along the bottom, you're making the assumption that's the gold standard test. It absolutely isn't. This is just for a graphical illustration. So if you were to divide results here, so each dot represents a result from the same patient, but using the two different tests. So on the axis going up, that's their Active B12 result. On the axis across the bottom, that's their Serum B12 result. And you can see that, broadly speaking, for patients with very low Serum B12 levels or very high ones, actually it doesn't make a lot of difference. Both tests will give you broadly the same. But where it gets interesting are those in the middle zone. Okay, so you'll see the ones that are green there. They're ones that would be picked up by the Active B12 test and would be indeterminate using the Serum B12 test. Right, so a little example. So the extremes either side, they're probably both just as good as each other, but more interesting in the middle. A more sophisticated way of assessing the utility of a test is something called a receiver operation characteristic curve. Now again, like most of what I'm telling you today, there are compromises in here. Now we did hear earlier that there's no gold standard test for B12, and that's absolutely true. But we need to have a proxy marker to do these sort of things. So in this diagram, we are making the assumption that methylmalonic acid, which I mentioned earlier, is a good functional marker of B12 status. Okay, so in this graph, we're making the assumption that if you have a level greater than 0.75 micromoles per litre, that you are indeed B12 deficient. Okay? So these curves are showing you the sensitivity and the specificity of those two tests. Right? So what we're going to go on to look at the next couple of slides is about how do these tests perform at different cutoff values. Yeah? So the cutoff value would be like a decision point. Your doctor will make a decision based on whether you're above or below that point. Yes? So let's look at the Active B12 test. So if your laboratory sets a decision limit of 30 picomoles per litre, the sensitivity at that cutoff is about 65%. So because I'm not very good at maths, I'm going to pretend there's 100 of you in this room. There's more than that. But in that scenario, if we were to screen all of you here, that would say we'd be missing about 35 of you using that cutoff. So that means it's got sensitivity to pick up 65 out of 100 of you if we were using that cutoff value, which is quite a low cutoff. But, and that doesn't sound very good, and it isn't, is it? But if we look at the specificity, what that's telling me is that of the ones that have been diagnosed deficient, then it's got it right in 90% of cases. Because one thing you're worried about is, well, there's two things. You're worried about missing people that are deficient, and in this case, we're missing 35 out of every 100. But also, you're worried about diagnosing someone who's fine incorrectly. Yeah? So in this case, we're getting it right at 90%. So 90% of those who we've said are deficient really are. Okay, so what if we change the reference range up to 60 picomoles so that we don't miss so many of you? Okay, what does that do to the sensitivity? Well, it increases it to 90%, yes? So now we are picking up 90 out of every 100 of you. We're getting it right. We're still missing 10%. If we look at the specificity, then we're down to 55%. So we're picking up nearly everybody, but we're getting it wrong. Nearly half of the people picking up actually aren't deficient. Yeah? So we're almost at a flick a coin stage. Yeah? So that's how the Active B12 test appears to be performing at the moment. So let's look at the Serum B12 test, which is one that you'll be more familiar with. So if your lab was using quite a low cutoff of 125 picomoles per litre, and I'm aware that some labs do use this, then the sensitivity is down to 35%, which means that you're missing the majority of people who really are deficient. It's very specific because you're getting it right in 95 out of 100. So out of those 100 patients that you've said are deficient, 95 of them really are, and you've only got 5 false ones in there. Yeah? Okay, let's use a higher limit of 250. The sensitivity shoots up to 85%. and the specificity is at 45%. Okay? Now, a typical cutoff in this country is around 148 picomoles. Okay? Now, I would say that the majority of people who are, I would say the majority of GPs or people that are dealing with these sort of things probably aren't aware of the sensitivity and the specificity of the test that they're giving for you. Okay? So hopefully now you'll have a little bit more knowledge yourselves about this. But we know that metabolic disturbances, which means an increase in the MMA or the homocysteine, can occur at least up to 300 picomoles per litre. Yep. So I suppose a take-home message of this is just the complexity of what goes on in the lab. Because every time you try and increase the sensitivity of what you're doing, you're decreasing the specificity. Yeah? So you could set a really high level, but the problem is then you're capturing so many patients who are fine and then diagnosed as B12 deficient. And you can't get away from that relationship between sensitivity and specificity. There are ways that you can address it, but you can't break that. So we just spent the main part of the talk there talking about two static markers, if you like. So both of those things are telling you how much of the vitamin's there. Yeah? If we start to look at some metabolic markers, we have a choice of two, which I've already said. You have the homocysteine and you have the methylmalonic acid. Now the problem with the homocysteine marker in this country is that there are other vitamins that have an impact on its level. So by far, folate has a much more powerful impact on your homocysteine level than B12. Now, if we were living in the States or other countries where they fortify your food with folic acid, then homocysteine would be a much better marker of B12 status because you're taking out the variation in the folate. So you'd be able to make the assumption that all of your patients are folate replete. So for that reason, we use the methylmalonic acid at St Thomas's as our functional marker. So the higher that level of methylmalonic acid, the more likely you are to be deficient in B12. Okay. So if you use any marker on its own, you've got limitations. And I would say that there isn't a single marker that will reliably diagnose correctly your B12 status. I would strongly suggest that a multi-marker is much better because you're removing some of the limitations of the test when they're used on their own. And there are some very good mathematical models that have been developed that look at all four markers together. And that is probably the most comprehensive way that you could assess anyone's B12 status. But as you can imagine, the cost associated with doing that for everybody would be significant. So, further models have been produced to see which 3 marker combinations and 2 marker combinations are the most similar to the 4 marker, which is very expensive to perform. So just as a reminder, the 4 marker combination would consist of serum B12, active B12, methylmalonic acid and homocysteine. So mathematically we can build models and take out one of those markers to see which ones are adding the least value. Yes? So if you were going to have a 3 variable analysis, the one to drop is the homocysteine. And if you were going to have just a 2 variable one, then the model that performs the best is the holotranscobalamin with methylmalonic acid. So if you can only get 2 markers, then they're probably the 2 best ones to have. The second best 2 marker model is the serum B12 with MMA. So I don't do that. I wish I could use a mathematical approach, but I'm not set up to do that yet. So I use a more simple approach, and it's not quite as good. I use a sequential analysis. So I make a decision on whether a second test is performed based on the outcome of the first test. So my screening test, and at St Thomas's and Guy's, we've been using the Active B12 since 2012, and we switched off Serum B12 in 2012, and we combine that with methylmalonic acid. And these are our cutoffs. And we could stand here all day and debate whether these are good cutoffs or not. These are the ones I use. But we do have a very wide intermediate area here, you'll notice. So that is here. So if anybody's results are in that zone, then we will automatically perform a methylmalonic acid. This is the strategy that we use. I'm not saying it's the best in the world. It's the one that we use. It's the best one we've come up with. And I understand that this will be posted online for you to look at. And in the smaller font here, these are cutoffs that other groups use for the Serum B12 using a similar approach. So conclusions. I think we're a better place than we were. The technology has moved on. We are now in a position in my lab anyway where we can perform 200 or 300 methylmalonic acid tests a day, completely automated. The Active B12 is a simple test to perform now, completely automated. So there are options out there. It's still challenging. I would suggest that combining a static and a functional marker gives you quite a comprehensive overview of your status. And we have had good experience with the B12 MMA in the last 4 or 5 years. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. I thought that was very, very interesting.
Thank you. Easy questions only, please.
What time frame might we be looking at for those tests to be offered in a general practice setting and to be understood by GPs, because that doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. I, for example, have had contact with a 12-year-old boy who was, to my what I could see was obviously B12 deficient. His B12 and measured in nanograms per litre was 220. And we had a methylmalonic acid test for him which showed that this was very high. But his GP doesn't know, never heard of that, isn't interested, and refuses to treat. So the kid's waiting. In the meantime, really all we can do is oral supplementation. But I mean, it doesn't seem to me that this information is getting out where it needs to be. Sure. So can you help me with that, please?
Yeah, I would say that there has been an exponential increase in the interest in these new tests. So when we started, we weren't getting many queries from other hospitals. I strongly believe that science is a collaborative process. So we are always open to people visiting us and learning the methods that we use. And what we've found in the last year or two is a really big increase in some of the bigger hospitals nationally coming to spend time with us to learn how we do the methylmalonic acid, for example. So I would say that things are progressing, clearly not quick enough, but we certainly have started to see progress. And I would say even from our unit's point of view, when we started the unit, I was looking back at activity, in October 1996, I had 8 requests for that month. In October 1997, I had 44. October this year, we had 25,000. Yes? So it's turned into a logistical nightmare rather than an analytical nightmare. But that's telling, and that's not just for B12, that's for all the vitamins, but there is a growing awareness that there's a problem. And I was talking to people earlier, it never meant to turn out this way. I never had an interest in B12. I'm a vitamin K man. But I'm spending less and less time with vitamin K recently, and everybody wants to talk about B12 and the challenges there. And I would say, having worked with several patient groups, this is a particularly well organised one, and it's one with a particularly loud voice. So I think you guys are going to have a big part to play in helping move things forward. Thank you for the question.